And thank you so much for coming. This is a very exciting evening for us. It's the second in our Representations of Disabilities series. And before, my name's Susan Dodd. I'm a professor in the Foundation Year Program in Contemporary Studies here and a co-organizer of this lecture series with my colleague and friend, Dr. Dorota Glowacka. Before I begin, I would like to gratefully acknowledge that this event is taking place in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people for thousands of years. This land is subject to the peace and friendship treaties, the first of which was signed in 1725. These treaties are the basis for peaceful coexistence and ongoing relations among all who live here, including those who come to study here. I would like to acknowledge the contributions to Mi'kma'ki of African Nova Scotians whose presence here dates back to 1604. And before I call upon the director of the Foundation Year Program to introduce our speaker, I'd like to call upon Michelle Mahoney, the Accessibility Officer here at King's, to say a few words of welcome. Michelle joined us in 2023 as King's first Accessibility Officer. She graduated from St. Francis Xavier University in 1995 with a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and worked at Dalhousie University for over 20 years before joining us here. Michelle sits on the Board of Directors for Easter Seals Nova Scotia and on Easter Seals Board of Canada as the Nova Scotia representative. Michelle guided us in every step of the way of developing this lecture series on representations of disability in historical, scientific, and artistic perspectives. And we're very grateful. So, Michelle. Thanks.
I think you should also add to my outline that I'm a downhill skier and I surf and I water ski, all adaptive sporting. And with right supports in place, you could do anything. So yeah, and it's an adrenaline. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there. So here we are again. This is the second public lecture. I'm so excited. I'm really excited with how well this has taken shape, and I even go to the classes every week. I feel like the students are keeping me young, and but I'm really enjoying the class with the students, and they're learning, I'm learning. It's so wonderful. It's so win-win for everyone. So welcome tonight to, this is our second lecture in the new series from our University of King's, the representation of disability in historical, scientific, and artistic perspectives. So this series continues to challenge ableism by exploring disability in art, philosophy, science, and activism. And we continue to focus on how ideas of, air quotes, disability and, air quotes, normality have changed over time and across cultures. By highlighting diverse and empowering perspectives, we aim to challenge assumptions and imagine new possibilities. So thanks again for being here tonight. I also wanted to tell you all that I found something interesting today. This event tonight was published in the Hamilton local news called The Spec, which, so The Spec is the online home of the Hamilton Spectator. So the Coast, Lauren Phillips wrote the story, and it was in the Coast today, as well as it made it all its way from to Hamilton. So I hope there's people online from Hamilton tonight. So anyway, welcome, and I hope you all enjoy Elizabeth's talk tonight. Thank you.
All right, and yes, hello to everybody on the live stream. And Dr. Robertson, the director of the Foundation Year Program, will just say a few words, because this is also the Angus Johnston Memorial Lecture. Thanks.
Thank you. And it's so wonderful to be here at the annual Angus Johnson Memorial Lecture, along with participating in this wonderful lecture series. I just wanted to say a word or two about Angus Johnston and why this is such an appropriate way to remember him. Angus was, to my mind, the embodiment of what the Foundation Year program was about. He was the vice president of this university for 12 years. He had a wonderful philosophical spirit, but above all, he was, in my judgment, the finest teacher I have ever encountered. When Susan suggested that we should be combining the Angus Johnson lecture with the Disability Lecture Series, there was a kind of perfect marriage there, because indeed, through Angus's marriage with Sandra Haycock, Angus was living, perhaps vicariously or in a supportive fashion, but living with a person who was engaged in living with multiple sclerosis and is still alive today, just both wife and widow of Angus Johnson. And so very much this was at the center of Angus's life and deeply informed his own intellectual thinking about the very nature of what life is and what time is, which is a perfect theme for Angus, who made time a kind of central aspect of his own reflections. So I'm so delighted that this is such an opportunity to remember Angus. But in particular, I'm here to introduce our speaker this evening, Elizabeth Bearden, Dr. Elizabeth Bearden. Her doctorate is from New York University in Comparative Literature. She's a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her interests are in early modern prose and poetry, the reception of antiquity, comparative literature, formal and philosophical approaches to literary studies, disability studies. So a very narrow focus, really. Her previous publications include The Emblematics of the Self, Ekphrasis and Identity in Renaissance Imitations of Greek Romance, published by the University of Toronto Press, and her second book, Monstrous Kinds, Body, Space, and Narrative in Renaissance Representations of Disability, was published by the University of Michigan, Corporeality's Discourse of Disability series in 2019, and was the winner of the Tobin Siebers Prize for Disability Studies in the Humanities. And she's published articles widely. But this evening is an opportunity for us to encounter her forthcoming publication, the Crip Authority, Disability and the Art of Consolation in the Renaissance, and you can order your copy in advance, I think, online from the University of Michigan Press. I have a description of what that book is about, but I'm guessing that Professor Bearden will do a much better job of articulating what is at work in her own thought. But let me say, beyond those accolades and accomplishments that have been part of her life, in the last couple of days I've had an opportunity to meet with Professor Bearden, and the combination of wit and wisdom, erudite, scholarly insight, but mixed, I found, beautifully with a sense in which she wants to include others in the articulation and the insight that is at work in her scholarly reflections, and the way in which disability has given her a kind of opening into some unthought aspects of the Renaissance. So I want us all to welcome Professor Bearden as she speaks to us about Crip touches across time, or getting in touch with disability in the Renaissance. Dr. Bearden.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's such a lovely introduction. I'm very humbled and appreciative. Let me just do a quick sound check. I can't see you if you're raising your hand in the back, but if anybody's having trouble hearing, could you raise your hand for our tech folks? Okay, good. Well, thanks to everyone, to Kings, to all of the wonderful people that have made this a lovely visit so far, even in the midst of difficult personal circumstances. So I'm very appreciative. Along with the talents that Neil kindly mentioned, I'd like to add that I am blind, work with the guide dog who is under the table here. Now she's a small black lab. And I use adaptive software. This also an access note for everyone. If you need to get up or move around, or if you need to leave, that's absolutely fine. I just ask you to try to do so quietly because I'm going to be listening to my notes as I speak. So thank you. So the aim of my new book, Crip Authority, is to recover the voices of early modern people with disabilities. This project brings to light pre-modern disability narratives, or first-person stories of the lived experience of disability before 1800. It considers how early modern writers used the art of consolation to resignify the mental and physical disabilities that their societies frequently scorned into a source of authority and pride. Their stories often emphasize disability gain, or the idea that disability is productive rather than simply a problem that needs solving. I coined the phrase Crip Authority to define this self-authorization derived from disability disclosure, consolation, and what we might think of as Crip touches across time. This talk is going to last for about 50 minutes. I start with 5 keywords that are central to my concept of Crip Authority. Next, I read Petrarch's famous letter on the ascent of Mont Ventoux in the context of overcoming disability. I next consider Petrarch's disability disclosure, consolation, and dignification of disability in his Secretum and De Remediis Utriusque Fortunae. I then turn to the blind painter and art theorist Giovanni Paolo Lomazzo, who further exemplifies how disabled people in the Renaissance use consolation to craft Crip Authority. The conclusion will return to Petrarch with reflection on the lived experience of disability. If you've never read any of this before, please don't worry, you're going to be fine. I read translations of Latin and Italian texts, so that also should make you feel more comfortable. I cite and sometimes modify the Bernardo, Nichols, and Roski translations of Petrarch. I cite and modify Jean Julia Try and Richard Haydock's translations of Lomazzo, but most of the translations of Lomazzo are my own. So let's go ahead and cue the first slide, please. Keywords. So let's start with a big word, disability. I use the word disability to delineate the cultural experiences of physical and mental impairment that my early modern authors relate. I do this with an awareness of historical particulars and in the same spirit in which scholars used words such as gender, sexuality, and race to make clear the exigency of linking these lived experiences of the past to the present. Number 2, disability narrative. The generic term disability narrative defines forms of life writing that disclose disability as an important part of my authors' lives and works. Rather than performing retrospective diagnosis, I attend to these authors' own accounts of disability. Number 3, consolation. This ancient genre or type of literature provided comfort and remedies for adversities, including mental and physical disabilities. Number 4, authority. Early modern writers cited consolation for authoritative examples of people living with disabilities in their past, as well as for strategies of self-authorization within ableist societies, where people with disabilities are deemed inferior to able-bodied and able-minded people. Number 5, the final one, Crip. The strategic and transgressive derivation of authority out of mental and physical impairments is fundamentally Crip. Like the word queer, use of the word Crip indicates identification with a community, as well as an often playful or ironic resignification of what society deems deviant. Okay, we can take down that slide now. So, getting in touch with Petrarch. Let me just have a little bit of water. Okay. In a famous familiar letter, Francesco Petrarca, Petrarch, writes that in the spring of 1336, he summited the peak of Mont Ventoux. This solitary mountain emerges with a windswept granite cap from the hillocks of the Vaucluse region of France that Petrarch then called home. The letter inspires assessments of Petrarch as the father of humanism. For instance, Jacob Burckhardt emphasizes the exceptionality of Petrarch as, quote, one of the first truly modern men who developed a, quote, free personality in which man became a spiritual individual and recognized himself as such, close quote. The letter continues to be a key text in debates about the Renaissance as a cultural and historical rebirth and step towards modernity. I read this letter along with Petrarch's Secretum and De Remediis Utriusque Fortunae to a different end. In Petrarch's work, disability is central to human experience and the humanism that sought to dignify that experience. Petrarch discloses his mental disability in the Secretum. He contributes to the Renaissance art of disability consolation in the De Remediis, and his work goes on to inspire many disabled authors of the Renaissance and beyond. Mountain climbing may lend itself to assessing the measure of man, but it's also emblematic for overcoming disability. For example, Eric Wehenmeyer claimed in 2001 to be the first blind man to have summited Mount Everest. His website promoted slogans such as overcoming fear and injunctions to live a no barriers life. The website defined, quote, no barriers philosophy as, quote, overcome, adapt, be resilient, embrace. That is no barriers. But overcoming narratives aren't for everybody. Noting that the mountain as metaphor looms large in the lives of marginalized people, Eli Clare relates that overcoming narratives promote, quote, one of the dominant images of disabled people, the super Crip. Such stories, quote, focus on disabled people overcoming our disabilities. They reinforce the superiority of the non-disabled body and mind. They turn individual disabled people who are simply leading their lives into symbols of inspiration, close quote. In a similar move, Stella Young decries what she calls inspiration porn, in which, quote, the only disability in life is a bad attitude. Although mountain climbing is a remarkable accomplishment, Clare and Young's point about the ableism in which overcoming narratives are based is relevant. Barriers to access exist. Pretending that they don't won't make them go away. For Petrarch, the story of overcoming is fragmented, scattered into diverging paths, and made errant in the folds of his citation and style of narration. Petrarch emphasizes error from the start of his narration. He coyly relates that he was moved to action by reading about the mountaineering of King Philip V of Macedon, as told by the Roman historian Livy. The thing about this is that Philip's expedition to climb Mount Hemus in the Balkans was a failure, as Petrarch well knew, since Petrarch made the first early modern edition of Livy. Furthermore, Petrarchan style embraces error and mental wandering. The first sonnet of his famous Canzoniere proclaims the work to spring from the speaker's juvenile errore, youthful error. Unrequited love constitutes this error, and error also constitutes his style, quote, the varied style in which I weep and speak, close quote. This dispersed, errant style expresses the speaker's emotional perturbation and distress and was imitated for centuries. Returning to the ascent of Mont Ventoux, Petrarch doesn't go solo. He invites his brother Gerardo and their servants along with them. From the start of the climb, Petrarch, quote, pursued a more modestly inclined mountainous path. My brother proceeded to the heights via shortcuts over the ridges of the mountain, but I, being weaker, turned towards the lower reaches. Petrarch says he is Molière, which can mean weaker or feebler than his brother, indicating that the climb is physically difficult for him. Yet he also discloses his psychological difficulty, attributing his waywardness to his ignawe, his laziness or faint-heartedness. He continues, quote, wandering through the valleys, close quote, which meant that, quote, the way grew longer and my exertion became even more useless. Petrarch repeats his error, quote, this happened to me 3 or more times within just a few hours, not without my annoyance or my brother's laughter. Here, Petrarch relates his error in a lighthearted manner. We're tempted to laugh along with his brother, Gerardo, at him, but Petrarch's error is more than a joke. Although he eventually overcomes superatis, the physical climb, Petrarch doesn't overcome his mental waywardness. When he finally summits the peak, it is not a triumph. Trying to make sense of his experience, Petrarch performs a sortilege. He picks a page at random from a little volume of Augustine's Confessions with the idea that the passage would hold special significance. I'm sure we all carry around a little copy of Augustine's Confessions. As with the example from Livy, this move reaches back to the authoritative past. Just as citing Livy insinuates to Petrarch's learned readers that the climb may not be a success, the result of Petrarch's sortilege indicates that Petrarch's spiritual journey is still errant. The passage upon which Petrarch's eyes fall discloses his error in an ironic and humbling manner. Forte, by chance, he selects a passage from the 10th book of the Confessions, quote, and they go to admire the summits of mountains and the vast billows of the sea and the broadest rivers and the expanses of the ocean and the revolutions of the stars, and they overlook themselves. This sortilege turns out quite differently from the episode in the Confessions that inspires Petrarch. Whereas Augustine's sortilege of scripture in the garden in Milan results in joyous certainty in Christian conversion, Petrarch's sortilege of Augustine results in stupefaction and frustration with himself. Quote, I confess that I was astonished, refusing to read further. Quote, I closed the book enraged with myself because I was even then admiring earthly things, close quote. I suggest that the disclosure of error in this moment invites a Crip reading and identification. Petrarch's appreciation of error creates community. It is closely tied to his reading citation and writing practices. In turn, these practices demonstrate his humanist authority to his network of readers. It's also playful. The practice of sortilege itself being a game. I'm sure you're going to go home and do this immediately. Right? Petrarch shuffles Augustine's deck to draw a deeper awareness of his own imperfection and suffering. Petrarch doesn't overcome the mountain as a triumphal, secular, independent, modern subject. He does not portray the challenge of climbing Mont Ventoux as an orthodox, allegorical representation of spiritual overcoming. At the end of the letter and his descent, he calls on Sepulcro, who is the letter's addressee and Petrarch's confessor, quote, I beg you to pray for my thoughts, so that having been vagi et instabilis, wandering and unstable for so long, they may sometimes find rest. Petrarch portrays himself as variable, vulnerable, and subject to error. The disclosure of error impels and constitutes the narrative that we're still reading today. Petrarch's climb resignifies his error in much the same way that cripping disability does not overcome disability, but resignifies it into something valuable and creative of community. When we pay closer attention, the manly exceptionalism, the overcoming narrative that many scholars have attributed to this letter, is question diverted, and I suggest Crip in its elaboration. Petrarch discloses his disability more directly in his work of autoconsolation, the Secretum, which he began writing around 1342. At its heart, and at the midpoint of the text, the character Augustinus names Franciscus's malady, quote, "You have a deadly plague of the mind. The moderns call it acedia, the ancients egritudo," close quote. "This condition is sustained and severe." Augustinus states, quote, "It has been a grave affliction of yours for a long time," close quote. Franciscus affirms this is the case. "Fatior, I admit that, I disclose it. Moreover, in all the other ills that distress me, there is something, however delusory, which is pleasurable. In this sadness, on the other hand, all is cruel and wretched and horrible. The way to despair is always open, and everything conspires to drive unhappy souls to their destruction. To make things worse, while other afflictions launch attacks that are frequent but short-lived, this sickness takes such a hold on me at times that I am in torment for days and nights on end," close quote. The terms used by Augustinus to diagnose Franciscus, egritudo and acedia, each have their own meanings and traditions, which are elaborated at length in the dialogue. They approximate what we would now call anxiety and depression. They both result in mental fluctuation and wandering, displeasure with the self, and contempt for the world more broadly. Petrarch didn't hesitate to think of mental disability in a transhistoric manner. As Augustinus states, quote, "The moderns call it acedia, the ancients egritudo." By the way, in Petrarch's time, they called themselves the moderns. I take Franciscus at his word when he says, quote, "It hardly matters whether you call it egritudo or acedia. We are in agreement, convenit, on the nature of the affliction." Petrarch's willingness to embrace ancient and more recent articulations of mental disability, his apparent openness to learn from their conjunction, supports a disability studies reading of his text now. The dialogue allows mental disability in different times and places to convenire, to agree or come together, or, as we could say, it allows them to touch. Learning from the past thus assists Petrarch in reckoning with and consoling disability in his present. But he doesn't overcome this disability. Like the ending of the Descent of Mont Ventoux, the Secretum closes with deferral and prayer for the future. Franciscus opines, quote, "I pray that I might issue safely from such winding ways. I hope my mind's fluctuations will subside, the world around me fall silent, and fortune stop troubling me." Petrarch left the Secretum unpublished during his lifetime. He extends disability consolation to a broader audience in his De Remediis. So if we could please cue the image of the Wheel of Fortune now. Finished in 1366, the De Remediis was the most widely read of Petrarch's works in the Renaissance, even more than his poetry. Here's an image of Fortune atop the wheel, Fortune taking from the Petrarch Meister's illustrations for the early 16th century German edition of the work. When things are going well, you're at the top, but it's a quick ride right down to the bottom. The treatise consists of 2 books of dialogues with allegorical speakers. The character Reason advises joy, hope, sorrow, and fear on how to handle both good and bad fortune. The De Remediis comforts people who experience a variety of physical and mental disabilities, from blindness to madness and chronic pain. So we can take down that slide now. In a letter written to Jean Birel, Petrarch notes, "I do have a book in hand, De Remediis, in which, to the best of my ability, I try to soften the passions of my mind and the reader's minds." So the process of reading and writing the De Remediis consoled Petrarch's own mental disability. Quote, "For when the pen came to dealing with sadness and misery, and I was engrossed in it, by chance it happened that the sword of sadness, arising from no certain causes, which the philosophers call egritudo, I assuaged by juxtaposing its opposite, which can be done in no better way than by searching for the causes of joyfulness. That is nothing else than seeking the dignity of the human condition. This dignity, as elaborated in the De Remediis, includes the lived experience of disability. The dialogue in the De Remediis, to which Petrarch refers in this letter to Bearden, is called Sadness and Misery, in which reason consoles sorrow for egritudo, along with offering a syllabus of consolatory sources. The character reason reminds sorrow that the world has many joys and pleasures. Reason extols the world's wonders, and here's just a taste of that speech. Quote, "Add here the beckoning hills, the sun-drenched valleys and shady glens, the icy Alps and the mild seashore, the wholesome bubbling waters and the springs, some sulphurous and steaming, some clear and cold, the sea upon the earth, the ever-changing streams, and the borders of kingdoms of never-changing permanence. Think of the foaming cliffs, the dank caverns, and fields of golden wheat, the budding vineyards, the ease of cities, and the quiet of the countryside, the freedom of the wilderness, and the most brilliant and noble spectacle of them all, the vault of the starry firmament that turns with incredible speed. In it are the fixed stars and the wanderers, as you call the moving planets, foremost among them sun and moon. On these depend the fruit of the earth, the stamina of all living things, and the changing seasons. By them we measure the year, the months, the days, the nights, and those short moments without which life would be dreary indeed." Close quote. This passage constitutes Petrarch's famous, and this is in quotes, famous counterstatement of the dignity of man, close quote, as Charles Trinkhaus has observed. However, I do not agree that it elevates, quote, autonomy and reveals a, quote, total focus on the individual as an individual that aptly illustrates Burckhardt's conception of Renaissance individualism, close quote, as Trinkhaus also argues. Humans are not autonomous in reason's cosmology. The world is depicted as interconnected in a tactile dance of movement and stillness. Geological features are touched by sun, shade, and ice. The oceans, infusa et circumfusa, pour out and circulate on the earth. As the courses of rivers deviate, and as some stars wander, amongst others that are fixed in their courses, orchestrating the passage of time. Humans do not entirely dominate this world, in part due to the Christian concept of the fall, which makes everybody imperfect, but also based in ancient concepts of personhood. They are, as Timothy Rice argues, a passable part of that world. They are vulnerable, variable, and capable of suffering and change. Furthermore, many of them are disabled. This speech appears in a consolatory dialogue for mental disability that takes human suffering and need for care as its premise, and it includes disability know-how, or what we call cripistemology, within its praise of human dignity. Reason goes on to praise this disability know-how as follows. Man, however though he be naked, is apparelled, adorned, and, when necessary, armed with a mind. If he gets lame and weak, he rides on a horse, in a boat or a carriage, or leans on a helpful staff. In short, he uses all available means to assist and ease himself. He has learned to make wooden legs, iron hands, and wax noses when these organs are missing, and deals with unforeseen mishaps by preparing medicines to brace his failing health. He wakes his sluggish appetite with spicy sauces, succors his bleary eyes with glasses. All these are the delightful pastimes of nature. She is a charming and kindly parent who restores to her children what she has taken from them and cheers again those whom she has made sad, close quote. The challenges that disability presents contribute to the dignity of human beings. In speaking of nature's delight in diversity, including disability, Petrarch taps a long tradition of praising nature's variety. He evokes what Pierre Hadot identifies as the Orphic rather than Promethean understanding of nature. Quote, whereas the Promethean attitude is inspired by audacity, boundless curiosity, the will to power, and the search for utility, the Orphic attitude, by contrast, is inspired by respect in the face of mystery, close quote. Respect for nature's variety enables Petrarch to embrace the material world as itself part of the miracle of creation. This dialogue appreciates the world's marvelous variety, including the errant and variable human body minds it encompasses. Petrarch's dialogues produce textured disability narrative that rides the highs and plumbs the depths of disability's lived experience. His works of disability consolation, themselves based in authoritative ancient models, go on to inspire numerous disabled writers in the Renaissance, who cite consolation to resignify their disabilities as authority to write. Okay, getting in touch with Lamazo. I'm sorry, I'm a little cold, so if I'm shivering, don't worry. I'm fine. I'm just a little cold. I mean, that's what I'm telling you anyway, right? So getting in touch with Lamazo. I now turn to another instance of what I am calling Crip touches across time, with the example of the blind Milanese painter and art theorist Giovanni Paolo Lamazo, 1538 to 92. As does Petra Kuppers, I draw on Caroline Dinshaw's concept of queer touches across time to emphasize the fellow feeling of disability now and reaching back to the past. Dinshaw avers that, quote, queer histories are made of affective relations, close quote, and, quote, such histories manifest by juxtaposition, by making entities past and present touch, close quote. Kuppers extends Dinshaw's formulation of touch history to, quote, Crip culture, calling into imaginary being a cultural formation by projecting backwards, finding moments where a witnessing sensibility can locate fantastical identifications in the lacunae, or gaps, of the past, a fellowship strange but recognizable, close quote. I add that we don't have to rely on our imaginations to fill in these gaps of affective histories. In his brief autobiography, or vita, Lamazo narrates his life and discloses his disability. He relates his birth, family, and education, and he lists paintings that he executed. Lamazo then discloses his blindness as follows. Quote, by a serious accident, my eyes were closed and I lost the beloved and dear light, which left me beside myself. Lamazo characterizes his onset of blindness as a result of a serious accident rather than a moral failing or punishment from God. Although his blindness is upsetting, Lamazo accepts his situation and finds consolation in art. Resigning himself to his fate, Lamazo states, quote, with many evils and many goods still, part of which I leave and part of which I follow, conforming to the eternal will of God, close quote. He accepts the will of God and that of fortuna, fortune, written in the cieli, heavens, to which me inchinava, to which I bow. Lamazo then refers to a medaglia, or a portrait medal, which the Milanese sculptor and engraver Annibale Fontana cast for him in questa cecitata, in this blindness. The Roman portrait coins of antiquity that Petrarch so admired inspired the portrait medals of the Renaissance. Portrait medals contributed to the authority of the sitter because of their durability and allusion to the authority of the past. They could be cast or struck multiple times in precious or alloy metals and were frequently given as gifts. These medals usually present a portrait on the obverse or front side and an allegorical scene and motto on the reverse or backside. Rebecca Howard emphasizes that early modern people encountered these metals with multiple senses. Quote, they might first notice the size of the object, sometimes small enough to hold between the fingers, sometimes large enough to fit in the palm. They could note the weight and even the temperature. They might even pick up its metallic scent, close quote. The tactile element of these objects is significant, for in, quote, studying the medallion, they run their fingers over the surface of both sides, turning the object back and forth as they experience the varying levels of relief. Fontana's cast of Lamazzo's portrait medal enhances Lamazzo's authority, and it does so in a manner that was accessible to Lamazzo and other potential blind recipients of the work. So let's go ahead and cue the next slide, please. Fontana's medal might have served as a consolation for Lamazzo, who could no longer see, but now could feel his own self-portrait. Lamazzo tells us that the medal that Fontana struck for him after he became blind is based on an earlier self-portrait, Retondo e Grande, round and large, now held at the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, that Lamazzo painted in his youth, probably around 1555 or 60. I'm the first person to notice the connection between these two objects, which is kind of perplexing to me, since it's actually written right there in Lamazzo's Vita. Anyway, on the slide, Lamazzo's painted self-portrait is on the left. The obverse of Fontana's medal is on the right. They both depict a classical portrait, profile portrait of Lamazzo. His features are rendered heavier and more distinct on the medal's face, which could reflect his age or could have made his features more discernible to the touch. He has curly hair and a beard. He wears a tunic tied over one shoulder, revealing the other distinct clavicle. So now let's move to the reverse of the portrait medal, and if we could cue the next slide, please. On the reverse of the medal, Mercury presents Lamazzo to Fortune, to whom Lamazzo bows, much as he indicates in his Vita that he inchinava or bowed to his fortune of blindness. Lamazzo is presented full length, again wearing that knotted tunics. Mercury is depicted nude, but for a loin cloth and winged helmet, he carries a caduceus. Fortune is nude, perched on a mound of earth, and holds up a cloth like a sail over and behind her head, indicating how easily Fortune, like the wind, can change. And I would try to emulate that gesture, but I have so many wires on me right now that I'm afraid it would, like, the one microphone would go one way and then the other, and then Fortune really would be coming to get us, right? So the Latin inscription or motto around the medal's edge reads utriusque, either sort, which serves as Lamazzo's motto and appears in the title of Petrarch's work of consolation, the De Remediis Utriusque Fortunae. In other words, Lamazzo accepts the fate of blindness, both the good and the bad. Although Lamazzo laments his vision loss, he insists that blindness does not end his creative life. It does not prevent him from continuing to work. And we can take down that slide now. It pushes him to work differently. He proclaims, quote, "Yet though raw chance deprived me of my eyes, I never stayed idle." He denies that disability has made him ocioso or idle. Blindness beneficially leads him to more theoretical work. Quote, "I turned entirely to theory, to which I dedicated myself solely to expanding these rules and observations with continual and strenuous study, but all the same never too serious. On the contrary, always cheerful and delightful," close quote. Lamazzo welcomes the difficult but also delightful work of composing theory. In particular, he argues that his blindness has made him a better art theorist by forcing him to focus on inner sight, which is essential to his concept of invention. In his disclosure of blindness in the Trattato, or Treatise on the Art of Painting, Lamazzo explains, quote, The natural desire that I have to augment this art of painting in which I was educated and raised from my childhood up to the age of 32 when I lost the light, and speculating on it from then until this age, woke me to the sight of the intellect and sharpened it so that I could investigate such matters, which I hope will not displease, if not everyone, at least the scholars of this profession of mine, as never having been declared before by anyone in this manner, close quote. Lamazzo's declaration of his ability to convey his art is confident. He does not express doubts about the utility of the endeavor, and his blindness only adds to his authority. Emphasis on the inner senses fits well with Neoplatonic theories of artistic inspiration. Lamazzo explains that the inner and not the outer senses receive a divinely inspired concetto, or idea of the work. Physical hearing and sight are distractions to be avoided in the creative process. The artist should, quote, flee clamorous noise and most of all occasions for seeing, close quote. Dampening physical senses is, moreover, important for not only the conception, but also the initial execution of the concetto. Jean Julia Chai paraphrases Lamazzo's advice as follows, quote, the form must be allowed to quietly emerge with the thinnest lines of watercolor or chalk on tinted paper, avoiding materials of high contrast, such as dark black ink on white paper, or anything visually jarring that might confuse or tire the brain, close quote. Lamazzo's ability to give advice on this matter is only enhanced by his inner sight. Lamazzo's work had a tangible influence on the later Renaissance, including on authors who themselves were disabled. In his Anatomy of Melancholy, Robert Burton cites Lamazzo's Trattato, which gives advice on how to depict melancholy and praises melancholic authors. The physician and advocate for deaf rights and education, John Bulwer, cites Lamazzo in his treatise on hand gestures and may have drawn on Richard Haydock's translation of Lamazzo for his use of the word motist, or one who is expert in communicating by movement, including sign language. It has also been suggested that John Milton drew on Lamazzo for the concept and figuration of landscape in Paradise Lost, and for his depiction of Samson's melancholy pose in Samson Agonistes. Certainly, Lamazzo's theorization of mannerism, in which the artist's body mind defines their maniera, or style, has been his most recognized legacy. And this theory is inflected with his blindness that contributes to his own maniera, or style. Lamazzo offers us another example of the importance of Cripistemology to Renaissance art by describing a portrait medal of Michelangelo that depicts him on the reverse as a blind pilgrim. Lamazzo describes the medal in the context of giving advice on how to depict pliable things, such as the wreathing of ropes. He warns that the artist should take care to represent pliable things with give, so as to avoid ridicule. Quote, it is not long since fell out in the work of a good carver who, in the reverse, where he had carved Michelangelo, made a blind beggar, led by a dog tied by a string, which seemed to be so stretched that it was as stiff as a staff, without any bowing, which gave occasion to a waggish boy to scoff at, saying that if the dog had strained the string so hard, he had either been strangled or not able to go any further, which caused certain painters who were with me to break out into an extreme laughter. So let's go ahead and cue the next slide, the portrait medal of Michelangelo. So here is a version of the medal to which Lamazzo refers. From the set point of his blindness, Lamazzo tells a story from his past in which he views an early version of a portrait medal of Michelangelo cast by Leone Leoni. The medal commemorates Michelangelo's 88th birthday. Michelangelo is depicted in profile on portrait medal's obverse. On the medal's reverse, Michelangelo is depicted as a blind pilgrim. He carries a water flask, rosary, and staff. He's guided by a dog on a leash. Around the rim of the reverse is a citation of Psalm 50, which is a penitential psalm that frequently appears in consolation texts, and which blind beggars actually frequently sang in the period. So Lamazzo, the blind painter, brings before our mind's eye a medal that itself depicts an authoritative painter as blind. Michelangelo, who was apparently very pleased with the medal, may have, as did Lamazzo, believed that blind people were blessed with inner sight and perhaps favored by God. Like most people, his vision may have declined with age. He might have also remembered his own temporary experience of blindness after painting the vault of the Sistine Chapel, which he painted in an awkward position with toxic pigments dripping into his eyes. As Simona Cohen argues, documentation of Michelangelo's collaboration with Leone proves that Michelangelo specified the image and motto. The initial form of the medal that Lamazzo viewed with his artist friends, in which blind know-how burbles up in laughter at the ungiving depiction of the guide dog's leash, gives us a window into a world that was familiar enough with blind people and their guides to make this sort of joke. The sculptor Leone apparently took the ribbing to heart, because extant castings of the medal, as is the case in the one pictured here, represent the guide dog's leash with more give. Because Michelangelo is such a famous artist, he makes it to Ninja Turtle status after all. This medal is better known and more widely reproduced than the one executed for Lamazzo by Fontana. In fact, while searching for an image of the Michelangelo medal, I came across a 19th century electrotype reproduction for sale on eBay. Happily, I received it as an anniversary gift. I am unaware of its provenance and hence of its previous journeys. I do wonder if I'm the first blind person to have handled it. I recorded the first time I handled it as follows. So this is me, the first time that I touched it. I have the medal on the coffee table, and I have my guide dog at my feet. The medal is about the size of a US silver dollar, though heavier. It fits easily into the hollow of my palm. I have small hands. The metal warms up very quickly, probably because the conductive properties of the copper used in the electrotype process. I can't smell anything wafting from it, metallic or no, and for now at least, I would rather not try to taste it. I suspect that the relief is not as deep on the replica as it would be on an original casting, but the figures are discernible to the touch. On the obverse, Michelangelo's portrait is easy to orient. The outline of his smooth shoulder gives way to the finely textured hair and beard. The face is not discernible in too much detail. The engraving of his name and the notation of his 88th birthday is not discernible to me at all. On the reverse, the full-length figure of the blind man, with his staff inclined slightly forward in the direction of travel, is easy to feel. I can discern the torsion of the man's body with which I am familiar from working with my guide dog on my left side. This action twists us into what Lamazzo and Michelangelo before him called a figura serpentinata, or pyramidal serpentinate figure, the twisting flame-like execution of which could capture a mannerist abstracted sense of motion in the still life of painting. I'm not sure if I would have noticed this contortive pose if I had not already known that working with a guide dog can twist our bodies in this way. The guide dog emerges to my touch. The slight downward curve of the leash is apparent, as is the perky upward curve of the dog's tail, which always reads to me as alert excitement to work. The dog's pose makes me think it is moving, with each of its four legs individually distinguishable, as during a working walk or trot, and with its head erect and ready for action. Scholars tend to gloss over the fact that Michelangelo condoned a representation of himself as blind, or else they conceive of it in allegorical terms. Though I don't disagree that we can interpret this medal's reverse, in an allegorical fashion, Michelangelo's own experience of vision loss makes his depiction as blind more than metaphorical. Rosemary Garland Thompson observes that people with disabilities draw on the conventions of Renaissance portraiture to reconstruct the representation of their disabilities with, quote, dignity and authority, close quote. She further observes, quote, being the subject of a public portrait symbolizes membership in a high status group, literally framing the subject as an appropriate member of the public sphere who is worthy of contemplation and commemoration, close quote. This practice of using portraiture to grant dignity and artistic authority to disabled subjects was, I suggest, already evident in the Renaissance when these conventions were being invented. In the case of the two portrait medals that we have explored, that authority could be conveyed just as easily through touch as by vision, making the portrait medal and Lamazzo's touching descriptions yet another Crip authority for telling disability narratives. I include Lamazzo's disability disclosure and how it touches on this portrait medal cast for Lamazzo in his marvelous blindness to emphasize how the history of Renaissance art might bear a Crip reverse, constantly present, though not often chosen for display, that can provide Crip touches across time. Permission to touch art is sometimes granted as an accommodation to blind people. Nevertheless, as Georgina Klieg and others suggest, quote, blind people who are granted this exceptional access could join with the professionals who regularly handle these artworks, conservators, exhibit installers, not to mention artists themselves, to add another category of aesthetic value, close quote. This is what I did last spring when I researched Lamazzo's portrait medal at the National Gallery in DC, and that's another story which I'd be happy to speak about with you after, if you like, including the perspectives of disabled viewers, scare quotes, and the experience of art and the history of that experience provides, moreover, an example of what Daki Masi calls disability as method, which is, quote, a creative approach through which research methods are informed by, modeled after, and tailored to the situated knowledges of people with disabilities. And it's from Activist Affordances. So, Crip conclusions. I draw your attention back to Petrarch's Ascent of Mont Ventoux, placing it in dialogue with disability narratives of Eli Clare. And if we still have a slide up, we can take it down, to show what disability narratives can teach about overcoming disability. Eli Clare returns repeatedly to the image of mountain climbing when working through the challenges and joys of life with disabilities. In Exile and Pride, Clare questions the overcoming story that Petrarch also resists. Clare ruefully asks, quote, how many of us have struggled up the mountain, measured ourselves against it, failed up there, lived in its shadow, close quote. And further on, quote, maybe we get to the summit, but probably not. And the price that we pay is huge, close quote. Clare questions how useful the harm of overcoming really is, if it's even possible. To my ear, nonetheless, Clare's disability narrative is at its most poignant when he allows the sweet and the sour of disability experience to jostle. Clare relates a failed attempt to climb Mount Adams in New Hampshire, expressing his desire to ascend, quote, to lichen-covered granite up to the sun-drenched cap where the mountains all tumble towards the hazy blue horizon. He is devastated when he can't continue, quote, I cry, maybe for the first time, over something I want to do, had many reasons to believe that I could do, but really can't. I cry hard, close quote. Clare doesn't hold back on how much this failure hurt. Yet he also takes consolation when he revisits the story in brilliant imperfection. Clare wonders at the mountain's secrets that his Crip way of descending reveals. Quote, On mountain trails, I yearn to fly downhill, feet touching ground, pushing off, smooth and fluid. Instead, on steep stretches, I drop down onto my butt and slide along using both my hands and feet, for a moment becoming a four-legged animal. Only then do I see the swirl marks that glaciers left in the granite, tiny orange newts climbing among the tree roots, otherworldly fungi growing on rotten logs. My shaky balance gives me this intimacy with the mountain, close quote. Claire's epistemology is based on a practical need to descend differently that has its own pleasures. Claire's wrangling with theoretical and material mountains expresses advantages and disadvantages of living with a disability. For disabled readers, it tells a familiar story, a version of which most of us share, but one that is very rarely used to explain Crip creativity. People with disabilities confront challenging origin stories for artists and writers. One demand being that they be super able in everything that they represent. From Plato's stipulation that the visual and verbal artist should be capable of doing everything they imitate in the Republic, to Horace's insistence that poets and playwrights be a jack of all trades in the Ars Poetica, the standard of being able to do what one represents in art is an impossible ideal. Along with this fantasy of super ability, creative talent has also been represented as a supernaturally granted recompense for disability. Homer's alleged blindness, Aesop's deformity, and the Platonic observation that all poets are mad also rely on supernatural intervention. This kind of compensation does not grow out of placing value on disability per se. Tracing how disabled artists and authors themselves find value in their experience of disability by discovering Crip authority in the past can help us move beyond this binary of superability and supernatural compensation. Writing with Crip authority resignifies ableist views of disability with disability gain. It underscores the value of disability know-how, such as disability metis, cripistemology, work, or masquerade. And it celebrates disability pride with a community of disabled readers across time and space. The idea of the author is not dead in the Renaissance, even though all of those Renaissance authors are dead. Many of them lived with mental and physical impairments, and many of them wrote about their brilliant imperfections. One thing is certain in Renaissance literature and art: the creators of the works that we so cherish had body minds, and those body minds helped them to their knowledge of the world, albeit along sometimes circuitous paths.
Yeah, that was wonderful, and I'm glad so many of the students from the class are here. That was really...
Extra credit.
Well, no, just in keeping with what we've been talking about in a big way, I think. So if you're up for a few questions,
Sure.
we'd like to open the floor.
I'll do my best.
Questions.
And you get to moderate.
Sure.
Yeah.
And we have people with microphones, so there'll be a little bit of scuffling before we hear the voices.
Just while folks think of their questions, I have a quick clarification question.
Mm-hmm.
I just missed the name of the person who was talking about disability as a method.
And I might not be pronouncing it correctly. It's Dokumaci, Dokumasi. And she is a professor, I think, at Concordia in Montreal.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I really enjoyed it.
I think you would enjoy that article. It's great.
Yeah, I'm absolutely going
Great.
There's some people over there on the right-hand side. At least one.
Hello, I'm an aspiring conservator, and I would love to hear more about your tactile experiences with art and how that can be incorporated into museums.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So I was kind of waxing rhapsodic about how great it would be to touch the Lamazzo medal, because I couldn't find an electrotype copy of that one. And, I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and he was like, why don't you, they held a copy at the National Gallery in DC, why don't you go and see if you can touch it? And, my not thinking about this was not due to a lack of imagination. It's just that there is often such a kind of gatekeeper mentality around touching art, and usually when you're a blind person and you're touching art, it's within very kind of narrowly defined circumstances that are part of public access programs. So, but even, I'm sure as many of you know, like even getting like the contact information of a curator can become like a real, it's like, it's difficult. I totally had to like call on, like it was totally nepotism. So my husband Michael's father, my father-in-law, was an art curator. And he actually put me in touch with the sculpture curator for the Crest collection, who's a wonderful person. I sent her like my chapter on Lamazzo just to like prove, I'm serious, I'm for real. And she was really excited, and we met there, and it was a beautiful experience. And the Lamazzo and the Michelangelo medals were in the same glass case. And so the armorer brought them down. I had to examine them over a gurney. It felt like an autopsy. But unfortunately, the gloves that the curators make you wear are not very conducive to touching in any great detail. So future museum workers, let's try to find a better way to do that. Because museums have multiple roles. One of those roles is to conserve and to make things last, but it's also to open them up to people. And there are many objects, and I think this is something that's been under a great deal of discussion with indigenous spiritual objects too. These are objects that are meant to be handled, to be touched, and to be experienced by people, and not just put behind. But you've got to come to these a sort of maybe a détente between these varieties of needs. And I had a wonderful time and had a great time with Allison Lunches, and just we both learned a lot. And the thing that was really exciting to me about that experience, because there were all sorts of barriers to that access, right? And I managed to get around them, including just the entrance to the service entrance of the museum was kind of a nightmare. But what really impressed me was that it was an equal exchange, and she appreciated me and what I had to say as a disabled woman and a scholar, and that knowledge was valuable. So I hope that we can have more experiences like that. And I write about it in the coda of Crip Authority too. So.
Thank you. Yes, a question from Neil, and then after that, back there with Mary.
Yes, with the word consolation, I can't help but think about Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
Was, of course, much translated in the Renaissance. And Boethius kicks Fortuna out, in a sense, and wants to replace her with the perspective of providence. And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about how the Renaissance thinks about disability in those two contexts, because you've been talking about figures for whom Fortuna is the context to think about disability in. And is there a way in which, and what kind of consolation that provides, and then the consolation that would belong to those who think about the context rather as providence?
That's a great question. So in the beginning of the Secretum, as you may remember, the character Franciscus is, as we often are, all of us scholars, just moping in his study, A much better situation than poor old Boethius, right, who's in prison. But a figure, a stunning woman comes and appears to him, and she introduces herself as truth, right? So that immediately engages this Boethian, kind of intertextuality there, right? And then, Truth introduces Augustinus to Franciscus, saying, well, Augustinus is the right person to talk with you about this. But she's in the room silent, during the entire 3-day dialogue. As to differences between thinking of disability as providential or kind of in a more, let's just say, pagan fashion of fortune, I think that the thing that we have to come up against there is what, for instance, Wheatley has called the religious model of disability, in which disability is always kind of thought of as either a punishment or a bestowal of God, a gift from God. And so some of my more devout authors, such as Teresa de Cartagena, who is a deaf conversa Spanish nun, she uses a lot of biblical sources, and she even does kind of what I call a Crip exegesis on Scripture to, in a way, interpret Scripture as a favorably to the disabled. So she'll take like Matthew's parable of the talents and see each talent as a gift that's given with disability. And some of those gifts are bitter gifts, right? We have Milton picking up on that in Sonnet 19 with his same allusion to the parable of the talents. It's interesting. It's funny that one comes up numerous times. But the Psalms are also a site for a lot of consolation that is engaging more directly with God's role, both as a protector and as someone to whom the psalmist laments. Is that kind of what you were getting at, Neil?
Thank you, beautiful.
Okay, sure.
I think Meredith had a question. We were talking about that, Teresa, in class today.
Mm-hmm.
Really interested in your idea of critical authority as someone who's both disabled and spent quite a bit of time studying Foucault and his ideas of power. Do you think that this idea of critical authority is at all oxymoronic?
No, not at all. So I think that, in fact, what Crip does is to take things that are, in a way, sort of serious or central or authoritative, right, and flips them somewhat. So this is not, my reading is not a Foucauldian reading. I think that Foucault teaches us a great deal about power and power dynamics, but I'm not really, I'm interested in docile subjects that actually, if they claim humility or if they claim docility, there's a little bit of a smile behind that. And I think that, when you look at historical records solely from the perspective of, say, legalistic or disciplinary records and histories, then you're only going to get the perspective of the difference as deviance, right? Whereas if you actually go to authors who have had that life experience and open your archive to their experiences, then you can begin to have, irony and playfulness around these lived experiences. So that is not in any way to diss Foucault, whose work I deeply respect and who, my advisor was friends with him. He was apparently very funny. But just to say that although I love Foucault, and I think I said this to Neil the other night, he doesn't always get historical things correct, in my view. So I hope that's helpful.
I don't know if this is really a question at all. I just was really interested in your description of the swirls of the glacier on the ground when you're talking about climbing up the mountain. And I guess I just wanted to know more about, like, I guess the experience of the tactility of like nature and its like relationship also with like tactility of art. Yeah, I don't know. I just want to.
That's a great observation. And, you know, I hadn't been thinking of Claire's experience as tactilely, but you're absolutely right. Besides, Claire's also has his hands on the ground when he's descending the mountain. And so those swirls might be perceived visually from more up close than they would be if you were standing, right? But then you're absolutely right that you could feel them. And, you know, Claire is an incredible prose writer, a very poetic prose writer, and I'm sure that he would be delighted to hear you make that observation. So thank you for that.
All right. Oh, question back there. We'll just take one or two more questions, I think.
I was just going to ask a little bit more about Lomatso's career after he becomes blind.
Mm-hmm.
Does he have patronage, or
Yeah.
does he make his way as a painter? Like, I'm wondering about Crip authority as does the non-disabled community buy them as authoritative subjects?
Oh, they loved him. So he was the president of his academia. He had, so he's from Milan, right, which is not, I mean, Milan gets more attention now, but it was always Florence for a long time. And, you know, that's partly Vasari's fault. But he is like so interested in praising not only male painters and sculptors, but women, embroiderers, people who have all of these trade skills, you know, goldsmiths, silversmiths, other kinds of textile workers. And he was part of this kind of like a society that they were the Blegno Valley Society. And so they made up their own language. And he was actually voted president or abbot of it after he became blind. And so there is another self-portrait by him that is a kind of more famous than the one that I displayed, where it's kind of a, you know, one of those allegorical self-portraits where he's got all these objects and a big hat. And he actually always represented himself as a melancholic also, which I talk about in my chapter, but I didn't have time to get into here. But so he also was commissioned, so he writes these works of art history. He also continues to write poetry, and he wrote these wild, grotesque sonnets that are like in this made-up language of Blinese. And they're very kind of erotic and strange, and they're called grotesques, right? It's rubbish. And he was also commissioned, because of his skill with grotesque art, he was commissioned by a patron to help create grottos and grotesque garden design, even after he went blind. So he was very respected in his community. And I don't, you know, it's a little iffy about whether or not, I mean, one of the things that I think about a lot, and I think it's important to remember, is that visual impairment occurs on a spectrum, right? It's not all or nothing. And so when I was very young, could paint, And then as my vision deteriorated, I had to work in other media. And so, it's possible even that, Lamazzo was able to draw for longer than he could paint, could do other things for longer than that, or could, he says that he presents his loss of vision as an accident, but we really have no idea at all what his vision loss was. And so I think it's kind of silly to speculate. He does say that it was actually predicted by Girolamo Cardano, but I think this might be just a way of him showing us that he was friends with Cardano. So.
All right. I think we're winding down. So if people will join me in thanking our speaker, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. And we have a reception in the Wilson Common Room on the second floor, so please join us. Thank you.
Thank you. I was kind of cold. I'm okay now. I mean,
The wine is in my office.
oh, you better go get that.